Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning, everyone who's come here into the room in Church House, and to the large number, I believe, who are also watching online. And welcome to the IFS 2024 analysis of the manifestos. Before I kick off, let me just advertise the fact that there is an enormous amount of extraordinarily good analysis on our website, which goes well beyond even what we're going to say here today. It looks back at what's happened since 2010 and forward at policies right across the manifestos, but also issues in tax, welfare, higher education, local authority funding, levelling up, schools, health, you name it, we've pretty much got it covered. So do take a look there. I should also preface my comments by just saying a huge thank you to all of my colleagues. I got back from holiday yesterday. Not terribly happy about the calling of the election on 4th of July, which I think, along with everyone else, other than those who put a few bets on it, I didn't predict. So I'm glad to be back for this event. I will, as is traditional, and I did actually mostly write this, read out some initial remarks, and then my colleagues will speak to some particular issues. I'll remind you again at the end, but we will kick off with Tom Waters, who will talk about some of the welfare proposals in the manifestos. Then Helen Miller, who will talk about tax, and in particular the rush to promise not to do anything on tax. Then Christine Farquharson will talk about public spending, and finally Carl Emerson will cover the public finances. And I should also say up front a huge thank you to the Nuffield Foundation and the Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust, who have very kindly provided funding for all of the work that we've done on this for the election, and also to the ESRC, who fund our work through the year, and on which, without which none of this would be possible. So I've headed this manifestos leave voters guessing over policy on tax and spending and on the future size and shape of the state. And I think that is our big beef here. We really have been left guessing when there are some huge choices which will have to be made over the next 5 years. Debt is at its highest level in more than 60 years. Taxes are at their highest level ever in the UK, though it's worth saying that on average earners, they're at their lowest level in 50 years. Taxes have risen more over this Parliament than over any other since the Second World War. Spending has also risen a lot, the fourth biggest increase per year in public spending since the war, and the biggest under a Conservative government. Now, it's worth saying we're going to be looking at the manifestos. You wouldn't have guessed much of that by looking at the Conservative manifesto in 2019, and I think that is worth bearing in mind throughout. So despite that high level of spending by historic standards, public services are visibly struggling, and we won't go through all of those struggles. I think everyone watching will understand what I mean. And despite the high tax levels, spending on many public services will, on current plans, likely need to be cut over the next 5 years unless taxes are raised further or government debt raises ever upwards. How can that possibly be? And I think this is a really important aspect for understanding the background for this election. How can we be in this world of high tax, high spending, but failing public services? Well, the answer is in large part a £50 billion increase in debt interest spending relative to forecasts, and a pretty big growth in the welfare budget over the last few years. We've also got rising health spending, a defence budget which for the first time in decades is going to grow and not shrink, and the reality of demographic change, and of course the need to transition to net zero. Add in low growth and the after effects of the pandemic and the energy price crisis, and you've got a pretty toxic mix for the public finances. Now, the two manifestos of the main parties essentially ignore these big challenges, these big facts, that huge decisions over the size and shape of the state will need to be taken, that those decisions will in all likelihood mean higher taxes or worse public services. You simply wouldn't guess from looking at their prospectuses or listening to the promises. They failed even to acknowledge some of the most important issues and choices facing us for a very long time. As the population ages, I think this is important, these choices are not going to get easier. As the population ages, they'll only become harder. We can't wish them away. Low growth, high debt, high interest payments mean we need to do something quite rare over the next few years just to stop debt spiralling ever upwards. We need to run primary surpluses. That means the government needs to collect more in tax and other revenues than it spends on everything apart from that debt interest bill. That's not necessarily a recipe for a happy electorate where you're taking more away than you're giving back. As I say, that is a very rare thing for us to achieve or need to achieve. And both parties are committed to the same fiscal target, which is that debt should be falling in 5 years' time. That's a loose target. It's looser than any debt target we've had since 2008, yet it constrains. It really constrains. Taking it seriously, and as far as one can tell, both manifestos do take it seriously, will mean the painful choices that we're outlining. None of that are faced up to. So current plans, and this is one of the difficulties of making sense of the manifestos, they don't tell us what current plans are, what is the counterfactual, but current plans in the budget are for big cuts in investment spending, 18 billion a year or so by 2030. Bear that in mind. Parties very focused on growth, but they both seem to be focused on big cuts in investment spending. And while the March budget assumes overall day-to-day spending will rise by 1% a year above inflation, anything approaching plausible settlements for the NHS, childcare, defence will leave other services facing cuts, somewhere between 10 and 20 billion a year on current projections. Hard to be precise, but significant cuts across other services. Now, we've called this a conspiracy of silence, and that has been essentially maintained. Regardless of who takes office following the general election, they might get lucky, but unless they get lucky, soon face a stark choice. Raise taxes by more than they've told us in their manifesto, or implement cuts to some areas of spending, or break their fiscal rules and allow debt to rise for longer. That is, to use that horrible word, the trilemma. What will they choose? I don't know. The manifestos do not give us a clue. So in these opening remarks, I'm actually just not going to engage on the whole with the so-called fully costed manifestos on their own terms. The proposals on tax, benefits and public service spending would be barely enough to detain us in analysing a modest single-year fiscal event, let alone a prospectus for a 5-year parliament. They certainly don't answer the big questions facing us. So, looking at the tax and spending proposals of the two big parties first, neither main party makes any serious new proposals to increase taxes. Consistent with their conspiracy of silence, both are keeping entirely silent about their commitment to a 10 billion a year tax rise through 3 further years of freezes to personal tax allowances and thresholds. Again, you wouldn't know that listening to them, but both main parties are committed to a big tax rise, which is, as I say, 3 more years of freezes to personal tax allowances and thresholds. Otherwise, tax rises such as they are all about increasing taxes invisibly on other people. All the parties, almost all of them, seem to be absolutely sure they can raise another 5 billion a year or more from cracking down on tax evasion and avoidance. Well, maybe. To be fair to this government, they've not done a bad job of that over the last 14 years. Though none makes much of the fact that on official estimates, most of the shortfall in what HMRC collects is not from big faceless conglomerates, but from the self-employed and small businesses. The Conservatives do offer a further cut to rates of employee and self-employed NICs, maintaining this remarkable fact, actually, as I say, that the taxes on people on average earnings are lower than they have been for 50 years, at least direct taxes, despite the high level of taxes overall. So that is quite something, as it were, from this government. They've got 2 other proposals, significant ones on personal tax, increasing income tax allowance for pensioners and reforming the high-income child benefit charge. Interestingly, those are 2 straightforward reversals of policies implemented by Conservative chancellors since 2010. But there have been a number of others, which I won't go through. Labour set out a handful of tax-raising measures that in aggregate are small, really small. So if you're a non-dom working in private equity and receiving income from carried interest and send your children to an expensive private school, then this is a big tax rise. Unfortunately for the Labour Party, there aren't many such people, and the amount of money available is therefore small. That is not a prediction of what will happen. Despite a damaging rush to rule out increases in all sorts of tax rates, it will be a considerable surprise to me, at least, if no other taxes are increased over the next 5 years. After all, they're currently much higher than implied by the 2019 Conservative Party manifesto. The manifesto has actually told us much more about what the parties won't do than what they will. Tax locks, that's pledges not to increase specific taxes or tax rates, aren't new, but this time the parties have really gone to town. We've seen a tax lock arms race. Both main parties have tied their hands on income tax, national insurance, VAT and corporation tax, and the Conservatives have added a long list of other tax rises and reforms they wouldn't do. They seem to think the tax system is essentially perfect, given what they've ruled out. And Labour, I think, have felt forced to rule out various options since the publication of the manifestos. Helen will talk at more length and probably with even more ire about that later. Taken at face value, Labour's remarkable promise of no tax increases on working people, if you take that in the usual English sense of working people, rules out essentially all tax rises. I can't think of many taxes which are paid exclusively by the inactive and unemployed. But frankly, who knows what the pledge actually is supposed to mean. The tax locks are a mistake. They'll constrain policy if a future government does decide that it wants to raise more money to fund public services. And they'll also put constraints on tax reform. As I say, something the Conservatives seem to have ruled out, and which is notable by its absence in the Labour manifesto. On the spending side, Labour's additional day-to-day spending commitments are trivial. They offer nothing on welfare. They do plan to boost green investment by about $5 billion a year, which, given that green investments are around $8 billion a year at the moment, is a big pledge, even if watered down from its original pledge. But it would still leave, and this is important on these plans, public sector net investment falling under a Labour government. The Conservatives claim they cut spending on working age benefits by $12 billion a year, largely by slowing the dramatic growth in claims and spending on disability benefits. And given that there really has been a dramatic growth, you can see why they're grappling with this. At the time of the last election, there were 2 million working age individuals in England and Wales receiving disability benefits. That will reach 3 million this year and 4 million in 2028-29 on current forecast. That is a huge and extraordinary increase. So you can see why the manifesto attacks it, but even so, cutting 12 billion will be tough. Promises to deliver much needed improvements to the NHS are essentially unfunded commitments. Both parties want to reverse a decade of rising waiting times. They reaffirm the commitment to NHS England workforce plan. That workforce plan possibly the biggest fiscal event of my lifetime, given that it will cost something like 50 billion a year by the time it's fully ruled out. But that is reaffirmed. They want to build more hospitals, expand mental health service. The list goes on. But these fully costed manifestos appear to imply that all this can be delivered for free. Of course it can't. You can't pledge to end all waits of more than 18 weeks and allocate no money to that pledge and then claim to have a fully costed manifesto. How would either party deal with backlogs in court system, prisons, funding in higher and further education, social care, local government? We don't know. Labour is proposing no change to spending on social security benefits. The two-child limit, which will affect an additional 2/3 of a million children by 2029, is due to remain. That said, Labour has committed to reviewing universal credit and to developing a strategy to reduce child poverty. Might those conclude, might they, that actually a more generous working age benefit system might play a part in lifting children out of poverty? Maybe, but if it does, we know not how it will be funded. To be fair, Labour's manifesto is full of reviews and strategies, and it's good to have reviews and it's good to have strategies. It contains a diagnosis of many problems and a recognition of how those are interrelated. Child poverty is related to mental health and schools and homelessness. That's all good. But again, if they find, shock horror, that will require more resources, we don't know how they'll pay. Now, this event is largely going to be about the two main parties, but it is worth saying something about the other parties. Their manifestos matter, not least because they'd help set the tone for the debate. I'll say something briefly about the Liberal Democrats. They have bigger tax and spend policies in their manifesto than the two big parties, wanting to raise taxes by 27 billion to fund a 4 billion boost in working age benefits and a 23 billion boost to day-to-day public service spending. They also want to increase investment spending. Now, their tax rises to pay for this would come largely from a combination of reducing avoidance, again, of course, increasing capital gains tax, taxing banks, taxing flying, taxing energy company and technology giants. Though their proposed measures were unlikely to bring in all of the revenue that they seek. There are some good ideas here, but there are some less good ones. I think the key point here is that sounded great, didn't it? The banks, the capital gains, the avoidance, the frequent flyers, from the point of view of most of us, victimless taxes. And as I said, partly we have got to a world where tax is near a record as a fraction of national income by hitting the apparently victimless. Corporation tax rate, the amount we're getting from corporation tax and from the highest income people is the highest it has ever been. But not all future big tax rises can continue to assume that all of this money can always come from these unworthy victims. More importantly, perhaps, nor can we assume that this is all economically safe and does no damage. I want to spend a little time, though, on Reform UK and the Greens. They offer much bigger numbers, very exciting, radical policies. Of course, they're not going to be implemented because they're not going to form the government. But I would suggest that the way that they suggest that their radical reforms can realistically make a positive difference, when in fact what they propose is wholly unattainable, does help to actually to poison the political debate. It makes the other parties look feeble when you say, we could do all this stuff. They can't. Take reform. They propose 90 billion by their numbers, actually it's a much bigger number than that, of specific tax cuts and 50 billion of spending increases, specific ones, paid for by a 150 billion package of measures that include substantial and completely unspecified cuts in welfare and government waste. If they want a smaller state, which is a perfectly reasonable ambition, they should tell us how they're going to achieve it. We saw the consequences of massive tax cuts with no detail on how they'd be paid for in September 2022. And what reform offers is on a much bigger scale than what we saw then. In any case, the claim they could eliminate NHS waiting lists for 17 billion a year is demonstrably wrong, while the vast tax cuts would cost even more than stated by tens of billions. On the other side, the Green Party has set out a vision for a bigger state, again, a perfectly reasonable ambition. They propose a set of tax-raising measures which they claim would allow them to spend far more on public services. The most scrutinised of these is a wealth tax. Actually, that's only a small part of what they suggest will pay for additional spending. A big part is an additional up to 80 billion a year of borrowing to be constrained only by its effect on inflation. Increase in borrowing of that scale, when the economy is currently capacity constrained, the debt interest burden is already a burden, would have unpleasant consequences. Their biggest proposal, as you'd expect, is a big carbon tax, £90 billion a year. Now, a carbon tax is a good way to help achieve emissions reductions, and a substantially higher tax would incentivise a faster transition to net zero, but it would also have very big economic implications, and any attempt to levy a carbon tax at that level would have a fundamental effect on the economy. That, of course, is the point, but it wouldn't be painless. They acknowledge this to some extent, but it would raise the cost of many essentials. It would be hugely economically disruptive. Much and probably most of the money raised would need to be used to mitigate those effects, support those on lower incomes, not to fund public services. And of course, if it was effective, this carbon tax in reducing the amount of carbon wouldn't raise anywhere near so much money. Let's talk briefly then about economic growth. There are differences between the parties here. I mean, to summarise, the Conservative Party manifesto, broadly speaking, puts its faith in cuts to taxes, regulations and red tape. To the extent that there are plans that are largely about getting government out of the way, the Labour manifesto claims growth as its central mission. Good. One of its flagship policies is to liberalise planning laws, and I have to say I bow to nobody in my keenness to overhaul our costly and sclerotic planning regime. I hope they are successful. It will be technically difficult, and it will be politically painful. So all power to their elbow on that one. On the broader set of policies, the mood music suggests a belief the state can fix things, an active, mission-led government that makes strategic investments and uses regulation, competition and industrial strategies to drive growth. That I think will be the centre part of a Labour government. They will be very active. A focus on green growth, money for net zero investment. But there's a really important point here. I have no problem with spending £5 billion a year on green growth, but that is not the same as growth. It's unlikely that green investment is what you choose if you wanted your most growth-friendly policy. That's a choice, but it's not the same thing. Now, I'm an optimist, actually. I've said this many times before about the capacity of good. You might not believe I'm on this general, yeah, I know. About the capacity of good policy to drive growth. Effective public investment, more private investment, planning reform, tax reform, removing barriers to trade, education, training policies, all of those things are good for growth, and they can and do make a difference. But some words of caution. Effects are uncertain, they take a long time, difficult decisions are required. There's a reason that we haven't done a lot of that stuff. It's hard, and some of it makes some people worse off. One reason why planning reform has proved so hard is that people don't like roads driven through their back gardens. But if we're going to get growth, they're going to have to get used to it. Ignoring tax reform, ruling out rejoining the customs union already suggests some pro-growth policies are beyond the pale. Even with much stronger growth, either a result of policy or of luck, that isn't necessarily a get-out-of-jail-free card. Suppose the next government gets really lucky and growth is forecast to be 0.5% a year, more than the OBR's already pretty optimistic March forecast. That's not impossible. It might happen. But even that would do little more than allow the new government to avoid cuts. It wouldn't create a spending bonanza. 0.5% a year doesn't sound like very much. It's a lot in terms of growth. If better growth materialises in the next Parliament, as I say, it might. That will be largely not actually to do with whatever policies the new government announces in its first few months, but luck. But luck might happen. But hoping for the best isn't a strategy. If instead the OBR take a leaf out of the book of the Bank of England and decide to get rather miserable, then the fiscal trilemma would suddenly look even worse. So, if you're asking for our votes on July the 4th, what would you do? Tell us, how would you respond to worse economic news? Would you put taxes up? Would you deepen the cuts to spending? Would you push back the date at which debt is forecast to fall? I honestly just don't know. We haven't been told. And a clear lesson, of course, of the last Parliament is that bad shocks do happen. It doesn't seem unreasonable for people to give us a hint of how they prioritise before polling day. So, let me conclude. We need more efficient and effective public services. The manifestos say that. We need a government laser focus on improving growth and economic performance. It's good to see that acknowledged. But on the big issues over which governments have direct control, how they'll change tax, welfare, public spending, the manifestos provide thin gruel indeed. We'll be voting on the 4th of July in something of a knowledge vacuum. If, as is likely, growth forecasts are not revised up this autumn, we do not know whether the new government would stick roughly to the day-to-day and investment spending totals set out in the March budget, whether they'd borrow more or tax more to top them up. If they were to stick to spending plans, we do not know what they would cut. We do not know what their priorities would be. If taxes are to go up, we do not know which ones. We kind of know which ones not. And we certainly don't know how they will respond if things get worse. The choices in front of us are hard. High taxes, high debt, struggling public services make them so. The thing is that pressures from health, from defence, and this is a new one, from defence, from welfare, from ageing, aren't going to make any of that easier. That's not a reason to hide the choices or to duck them, quite the reverse. Yet hidden and ducked they have been. Well, we're not going to hide them, we're not going to duck them, we're going to talk about them at length. So brace yourselves. Tom, as I say, will start to talk about welfare and personal taxes. Helen will be grumpy about the tax locks. Christine will talk about public service spending, and Carl will round it off by being seriously optimistic about the public finances.
Thanks very much, Paul. Okay, so as Paul said, I'm going to be kicking us off by looking at what the parties have said about personal tax and welfare. And so starting off with tax, the Labour Party have announced a £2 billion tax rise from a number of measures. The basic take-home message here is it's a relatively modest amount that's coming from largely high and often very high income households. By contrast, the Conservatives have announced a £16 billion tax cut. That's mostly coming from reductions in national insurance contributions from employees and a big reduction from the self-employed. And they've also planned to increase the income tax personal allowance for pensioners. Both parties also hope to get another 5 or 6 billion quid from reducing avoidance and evasion. But importantly, these reforms come against a backdrop of recent increases to tax, and there's another £10 billion tax rise coming down the pipeline through the threshold freezes in income tax and national insurance. And importantly, neither party has announced a deviation from those plans. So taking a step back, what does recent tax policy and the Conservatives' plans mean about the direction of personal tax? So here I'm going to look at the Conservatives' plans, but actually many of the things I'm about to show apply equally to Labour. So the income tax personal allowance went up quite a lot in the 2010s, and then it's been cut back significantly because of the tax freeze, undoing about half of that 2010s rise. At the same time, the higher personal allowance that used to be in there for pensioners, that was cut across the course of the 2010s. The Conservatives now want to reintroduce it. And so you can see here, for the personal allowance alone, we've been on something of a tax roller coaster. But if it turns out that there's lots of roller coasters about, enough to form a, no doubt, very successful tax-based theme park. And the second ride that you're going to be jumping on at the theme park is the primary threshold in national insurance. That's the point at which you become liable for national insurance contributions. That's been increased a lot since 2010, but again is due to be cut in the coming years. A particularly thrilling ride has been seen for the higher rate threshold. That was cut under the coalition, increased across the course of the 2010s, and then has been cut back again since through the threshold freeze, and will hit its lowest level since individual taxation began in 1990. And finally, the main rate of national insurance contributions, that was increased in 2011, increased again in 2022, breaking a Conservative manifesto promise, but then has been cut back repeatedly over the last couple of years, and under the Conservatives' plans would be cut back further still. And so much of what's happened since 2020 and is set to happen under the Conservatives is undoing a lot of that 2010s policy. And again, much of this the Labour Party have not announced a deviation from. So that's tax. Let's look now at benefits, starting with child benefit. So we means test the child benefit system essentially through the high income child benefit charge. That was introduced by the coalition, and I think it's fair to describe it as a mess. It's a strange kind of hybrid between individual taxation and joint taxation, where for the means test, the income of the lower earning parent doesn't matter at all, and it implies high marginal tax rates for those that have got several kids. Now, we haven't heard anything about this from Labour. We have heard something from the Conservatives. They'd like to make that means testing based on joint household income rather than the income of the higher earner. And they'd like to raise thresholds so that only 0.9 million families would lose some or all of their child benefit, down from the 1.8 million number that currently lose some. Now, I think this is clearly a more coherent way of means testing the child benefit, but it is administratively more complex. Our tax system is an individual one, and doing it this way amounts to bringing in joint tax information. So turning now to another part of the benefit system that has serious challenges, and that's health-related benefits. So here I'm showing spending on incapacity benefits, those for who their health condition stops them from working, plus disability benefits, those whose health condition generates additional living costs, since 2010. Now, back in 2010, spending on these benefits was £26 billion a year. Before the pandemic, that number had risen to 34 billion. Today, it's 51 billion. And by 2028, on current forecasts, it will be 59 billion pounds. At the same time, spending on all other working age benefits has fallen by about 13 billion. But as you can see, that's not been enough to offset the rise in health-related benefit spending, leaving the overall working age benefit bill something in the order of £20 billion higher than it was in 2010. Now, I think it's clearly reasonable for any party or any government to be concerned about this rise in the health-related spending. And we have heard something about this from the Conservatives. They'd said in their manifesto they'd like to shave £12 billion off welfare. They listed about half a dozen or so policies with which they wanted to do that. And of those, really only one of them isn't already in the forecast and could at least potentially be big, and that's a reform to disability benefits. We don't have lots of detail here, but the basic view seems to be, that's motivating it, seems to be, well, look, spending is increasing so fast, so all we've got to do is hold spending down to its current level or get it back to its pre-pandemic level, and that makes you huge savings relative to forecast. Now, that is true, but it is much easier said than done. Now, we don't know exactly how they would implement this sort of policy, so to just kind of illustrate the scale of the reform that would be required, if they wanted to save £12 billion by reforming disability benefits to make them harder to qualify for, what kind of thing would they have to do? So this is the number of people who are on disability benefits since 2002. You can see it's been rising pretty rapidly recently, and on current forecasts will continue to rise, topping 4 million by the end of the Parliament. If you want to save £12 billion by making these benefits harder to qualify for, you've got to make that dotted line instead do something more like that. That would amount to a £12 billion saving and would equate to 1.6 million claimants losing being disallowed from disability benefits and losing on average £7,500 a year each. Now, there's a cautionary tale here, which is that about 10 years ago, the government tried to reduce disability benefit spending through a reform called personal independence payment. And the hope was that it would reduce the disability benefit bill by 20%. And you can see with this forecast here that the forecast was for disability benefits spending to go down. What actually happened? It went up. And this underlines the point that these sorts of reforms often don't deliver the kinds of savings that had been hoped for. What other tools could the Conservatives turn to? They could cut disability benefit rates. That would be technically straightforward to do. Politically, it might be very difficult. They could look at trying to cut the incapacity benefit caseload as well, essentially spreading the pain amongst more people. Or, of course, they could just turn to non-health-related benefits. An important point of historical context here is that back in the 2015 general election, the Conservatives also promised to save £12 billion from the welfare budget. And they did make substantial progress on that target with using a number of policies, but it was politically difficult. They suffered a House of Lords rebellion, amongst other things. What about Labour? Labour have given a couple of indications of intent, but again, not very much in the way of concrete detail. They say they'd like to reform or replace the assessment for incapacity benefits, that is actually already government policy, and to develop a proper plan to support disabled people to work. Now, I don't doubt that some sort of plan along these lines could make a difference to some of those numbers I was just showing you, but really the bigger picture is that absent quite sudden improvements in national health, whoever wins the election is likely to have to make hard choices here, either accept much higher spending or significantly tighten the system. One more word on welfare, and that's its connection to child poverty. The Labour manifesto said they'd like to develop an ambitious strategy to reduce child poverty. Relative child poverty has increased by about 3% since 2010. And we've been here before. Back in 1999, the Labour Party had plans to end child poverty. And the progress they made on those targets was done with welfare doing much of the heavy lifting. This time around, we haven't had any significant welfare announcements, including on policies that the party had been very critical of in the past, such as the two-child limit, the benefit cap, and the so-called bedroom tax. And importantly, the two-child limit is set to increasingly bite over the next Parliament. The way it's implemented means it's steadily rolled out over time, and another 670,000 children will be affected by the end of the Parliament, putting upward pressure on child poverty. Now, of course, one can make progress on getting poverty rates down using means other than the benefit system, but it is harder to get very significant, very quick results. And so, if this is to be a priority for Labour, this could mean more pressure on the public finances. So bringing together everything I've said about tax and benefits, what would all of this mean for household incomes? So overall, there's already about a £400 per household per year takeaway on average already in the books through lower benefits and largely higher taxes. Now, Labour want a somewhat larger takeaway, while the Conservative manifesto ends up being, on average, almost exactly the same as existing plans. Now, for both parties, the biggest tax-raising part of their manifesto is clamping down on tax avoidance. The Labour Party also have some modest additional tax rises on private schools, non-doms, and private equity. which will mainly hit the rich. If I just exclude those and and look at the changes to headline benefits and income tax and national insurance that I've been talking about, and that we can model the distributional effects of, you can see that the Labour square and the current plan's X are exactly on top of one another because Labour aren't proposing any changes to headline benefits or income tax or NICS policy. The Conservatives, at the same time, plan a somewhat smaller takeaway. Now, these are the effects on average, but what do these reforms mean across the distribution? So starting again with current plans are for a broadly progressive increase in tax from tax thresholds being frozen, implying larger reductions at the top of the income distribution. The Labour Party's plans are just exactly the same for the reason I just gave. They don't plan any changes to headline benefits or income tax or NICS rates, though they do have some modest tax rises on the rich, not shown here. For the Conservatives, if I exclude their plan to take $12 billion off welfare, you can see their manifesto amounts to increases in income across the board. But once I incorporate £12 billion coming from disability benefits, their plans amount to taking significant income from the bottom half of the income distribution and modest increases at the top. But all of these are, in the grand scheme of the last 14 years, not enormous. I can show you this with this green line here. It shows the impact of reforms since 2010. And whoever wins the election, if their manifesto is to be implemented, the basic picture that we've seen since 2010 of big takeaways from the top, big takeaways from the bottom, and increases in income for the middle will still pretty much be there. So, taking everything together in summary, the Labour Party broadly plan to keep to the existing personal tax and benefit system. That implies takeaways from the top. The Conservatives plan tax cuts which increase incomes for the top half, paid for by reducing benefits for the bottom half. But all of this is fairly small beer compared to the last 14 years of reforms. And importantly, whoever wins the next election faces a challenge with rapidly rising health-related benefit system. And so far, neither party has really told us much about what they want to do about that. I'll pass you on now to Helen, who's going to talk about tax locks.
Thank you, Tom, and hello, everyone. So I'm going to tell you about what the party said they're not going to do on tax. So tax locks, these promises not to raise specific taxes, certainly aren't new, but we've seen many more of them in this election. And of course, it's perfectly legitimate for a party to want to say they don't want to raise a particular tax or a tax overall, but I'm going to argue that locking tax in this way is problematic. And one of the problems is that it ties your hands. It restricts what you can do if you decide you want to raise revenue. I think importantly, even if the parties are right, they genuinely don't want to raise revenue at the moment, if the last few years have taught us anything, it should surely be that things can change and could change pretty quickly. So with that constraint in mind, I'm going to basically show you this chart, which is where we currently get tax revenue from. I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour of the pie chart, looking at the main tax locks and what would be left to a government if they did decide they wanted to raise revenue. There's quite a lot of details going on here, so in the slide pack there's a list of all the locks. I'm going to start with the big three taxes. So income tax, national insurance and VAT are big workhorse taxes that together drag in 2/3 of the total revenue the government raises. The Conservatives have said they would have no rise in the income tax rate. That would in principle leave open raising savings taxes or cutting thresholds, and we've seen in recent years that can be a very lucrative business indeed. No lock on national insurance, probably because they have this ambition to abolish national insurance eventually. Of course, if that ambition applies only to, for example, to employee national insurance, that would leave open employer national insurance, which is the bigger part of national insurance. Separately ruling out reducing reliefs on pensions, that would cap some of your options for changing income tax and NICS, and no rise in the VAT rate, but again leaving in principle open the VAT base and the threshold. Labour have a pledge for no rise in the basic, higher or additional rate of income tax, and that's nice and clear, I understand that one. No rise in national insurance at all, no rise in VAT at all, but then this very broad no rise in taxes for working people. I have no idea what that means. And the more people have tried to explain it, the less clear I am about what a working person is. I think I'm a working person, but I'm no longer sure. The serious point here is clearly that if you define it very narrowly, maybe it only rules out a few more tax options than is already ruled out by the other pledges. Define it very broadly, and you've ruled out everything on the basis that all taxes are paid by people and most people work. So I don't know what it means. What I can say is that both parties have clearly ruled out the easy sources of large revenue. So some real constraints here on what a future government could do. Continue our tour around the pie chart. We get a chunk of revenue from other indirect taxes, very few locks here, so things like alcohol, tobacco duties, fuel duties, a bunch of environmental levies on the table. Decent chunk from company taxes. The big one here is corporation tax. There are some locks there, but there would still be some smaller things you could do, changing the specific smaller taxes on banks, energy companies, the North Sea, some multinational bits. There's business rates, which both parties say they would like to change, but the Labour Party explicitly saying they don't want to raise any more revenue from that source. And there's council tax, and what a sorry state we're in there. Everyone, I think, now knows that it's horribly out of date. I think everyone knows it's grossly unfair. The Conservatives ruling out reform on principle, and Labour, depending on what you listen to in the media, I think, from my point of view, is basically saying they haven't got the political appetite to tackle that. I'm going to come back to these little pink slices. These are the little capital taxes. Before I do, here's a list of the taxes outside of the top three that either party haven't locked down. So these are places you could look for revenue if you wanted to raise it. And at first you might think, well, that's okay, that's quite a long list, there's lots of taxes on there, we're all good. In practice, I think there was it's much more constrained than that list would look. For a start, a lot of these are actually very small. You'd have to do a lot, or do a lot of them, to get anything more than change behind the sofa. Some of them just look politically unrealistic. I mean, take fuel duty. It's the kind of biggest single thing in this group. But governments since 2011 haven't even managed to raise it in line with inflation. The idea is to be a big money spinner, obviously, not politically likely. And in fact, fuel duty revenues will be declining. So there are kind of risks on this list as well as opportunities. I think the final thing to say is that just because you can raise revenue from a tax doesn't mean you should. There are definitely some bad revenue-raising options on this list. I feel I have to highlight insurance premium tax. That's been the stealth tax of choice in recent years. It's gone up a lot. It now raises more than inheritance tax and is at unjustifiably high levels. So there are places you can get money. Doesn't mean you should always go for them. So in practice, some options there, but I think a government would find it harder to raise big revenue there than it may look from the list. So let's come back to those little pink bars I showed you, the capital taxes. The Conservatives ruling out almost everything here, so I'll just look at the options for Labour. I hesitated to put stamp duty on the list because it hasn't been locked down by the Labour Party, and in fact they have a small rise in their manifesto, but it's a horrendous tax. We absolutely should not be raising it, whether you're doing it in general on foreigners or second homes or whatever. It's a bad idea, however you're doing it. Ideally, we should be planning how to reduce and eventually abolish it. Inheritance tax will still be open for the Labour Party. Obviously, lots of things you could do there, but just to highlight one thing that I think you should do, regardless of how much money you want to raise, is remove or at least cap various reliefs, including those for agricultural land, businesses and pensions. So some good options there, regardless of how much you want to raise, but you could raise some money there too. And then capital gains tax, which has got some attention recently. We have a whole bunch of capital gains tax rates now. If you raise them, you could raise a bit of revenue. I say a bit because I think it wouldn't be that long before you started worrying about losing revenue, in fact. The big problem with capital gains tax, as it's currently designed, is that higher rates discourage investment. So I think it'd be hard to get anything very substantial from current capital gains taxes. The good news is that much better options are available. I mean, very big picture. We could fix the tax base, we could remove some reliefs. That would make for a much better, less distortionary capital gains tax. It also means that if you had higher rates, you could raise more revenue. So I think money to be got there, but would need serious reform, not just easy wins. And that brings me on to the other problem I have with tax locks, which is that they are bad for tax reform. Now, the Conservatives seem to be ruling out tax reform on principle. They've looked at the tax system with all its flaws and decided they like that just as it is, thank you very much. Labour, for the Labour Party, I think tax reform is notable by its absence. There's this one exception, they want to change business rates and they haven't yet worked out what they want to do with it. But other than that, nothing said about tax reform. I think that's a real shame because better taxes would, and in my opinion, absolutely should, be helping to address some of the key challenges that have been identified, including those around boosting growth and moving to net zero. And we could think of lots and lots of ways where we could design packages of measures that would be revenue neutral. They didn't have to cut or raise revenue if you didn't want to, but that would mean rises for some groups and some people. And that's where tax locks become the problem. We've ruled out some just good tax design, improving the system options through these tax locks, probably, I think, before anyone's even realised there was a tax reform option here. They've been ruled out on revenue basis and they've shut down other options. But rather than launch into a seminar about tax design, which is always very tempting, what I'm going to do to wrap up is kind of step back, kind of pan out, and think about the broader context here. Everything I've talked about so far is a political constraint. This is politicians choosing to try to tie their hands, and in future they will have to choose how to abide by those constraints. But there's some real constraints out there in the world too. And I think that's worth thinking about. If you think about the manifestos as a whole, not just the big two, and you look at where parties are saying they want to raise revenue from, then outside of the normal, we'll get more from evasion and avoidance, and who can't love that if you can do it, then the tax rises are really focused on getting more from top incomes, more from wealth, more from companies, particularly at this election from banks and energy companies. And that's where some of the context here is worth remembering. So on this kind of like taxing the rich, however you want to define them, we've seen an ongoing trend for decades in that we're raising more income tax from the very top of the income distribution. That's been continued as a result of policy choices since 2010. As Paul said earlier, income tax in Nixon average earners is actually lower now than it was in 2010. Doesn't mean we can't raise more from the top. We probably could, well, we could, but there is a limit to how much you can rely on only just raising income taxes at the very top. And more broadly, thinking beyond income tax, of course we could raise more from the rich, however you want to define them, but I think it almost certainly needs to be looking at substantial reforms, not just easy tweaks to rates. So we can do it, but I think we should be wary of things that look like easy wins. And on taxing companies, we could go into all the details here, but we have to remember that international mobility is a constraint on what we can do, and all taxes are paid by people. So we shouldn't think that any tax is victimless. What I want to highlight here is not that we couldn't raise revenue. We obviously could, even with some of these tax pledges, or these tax locks. There are lots of other countries that raise lots more than we do. There are still options here. But what we need is a sensible debate about how we want to raise taxes, how to design our system, who should be paying more, who should be paying less. We haven't seen that debate in this election. It's absolutely not helped by tax locks. I think we all should hope that in the next Parliament we see a much better debate about what to do with our tax system. And with that, I'll hand to Christine. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Well, Helen has told you about what the parties don't want to do on tax. Tom has told you a little bit about what they might want to do on welfare. Paul has told you about the really big picture conundrum that this puts us all in. And so what I want to do in this talk is talk through what this actually means for public services, what's the legacy that the next government is going to inherit, and what have the parties set out about how they want to change that, if at all. I think we've all seen that the next government is going to inherit a really difficult legacy on public service spending. This chart is showing you total day-to-day spending on public services and how that's changed since 2009, 2010. And we see that during the austerity years, spending fell quite sharply, COVID hit, and we saw really big increases in spending. But at the end of the day, we're currently around 5.5% higher on public service spending than we were back in 2009-10. That's overall. If you were to look at that in per person terms, accounting for the growth in population, that would be about 5% down. So this is a genuinely difficult legacy overall. But of course, not all government departments have been affected equally. We can see some, like health and social care, have actually seen big increases over this period. Home Office up about 20%. Even education had big cuts, but has since largely returned back to where it was before. But a lot of other departments have seen really quite substantial cuts to spending still on where they were back in 2010. And those are some really important ones: defense, justice, environment, foreign affairs. Some of the biggest losers were the Department for Work and Pensions and Housing and Communities. The latter is down more than 2/3 since 2010. So this is a really challenging fiscal picture. And the March 2024 budget basically looked at that, much like Helen was saying about the tax system, and said, we're going to do a little bit. We're not going to do very much. We're going to do a little bit. We're going to put budgets up by about 1% per year on average. Now, of course, my colleagues looked at that, and once you start digging into what that means for specific departments, areas like the NHS, defense and aid, where we have international commitments, schools, childcare, those areas might well see bigger increases on the order of 2 to 3%. But more increases there leaves less money for other services. And so those unprotected areas were on course for about 2 to 3.5% year-on-year cuts in spending. And that works out to about a 10 to 20 billion pound top-up that you would need to make in 2028 if you wanted to protect those budgets in cash terms, in real terms, if you wanted to avoid those cuts. And that was what led one Paul Johnson, in a room considerably less fancy than this one, it really has to be said, to conclude that government and opposition are joining in a conspiracy of silence in not acknowledging the scale of the choices and trade-offs that will face us after the election. They, and we, could be in for a rude awakening when those choices become unavoidable. So, have we had our awakening yet? What have we learned during the campaign so far? Well, the big picture answer is not very much. This is that 1% year-on-year increase that was set out in the March 2024 budget, and this is what we can conclude from the Labour and the Conservative Party manifestos. Labour edging those plans up ever so slightly to about 1.2%, the Tories edging them down by an even slighter amount to 0.95 instead of 0.97. Manifestos for the fiscal geeks, these were not. But almost as interesting as this overall picture is what this could potentially mean for individual areas of public services. And the big picture here, as Paul set out and as my colleagues B and Max have shown, is that we largely really don't know. We don't have a baseline. That leaves a huge range of uncertainty, a huge amount of different choices that the next government could take. But let's do our best. Let's make some plausible assumptions. You might think that a reasonable starting point is we take those overall numbers and we just apply them to all government departments equally. That looks, on its own terms, like an end to austerity, as indeed the Labour Party manifesto promised. No area of public service here is seeing real terms cuts. Everyone is getting modest but positive increases year on year. But do we really think that this is what we're actually going to end up with? Well, the first clue that it's not might be when you start to look at the party's commitments on health. We saw remarkably little detail overall on NHS funding. Neither party set out an overall spending plan. Both have promised really quite small pots of additional funding, small in the context of the overall NHS budget. And in addition to that, the Conservative Party manifesto made quite a weak commitment to keep the NHS funding growing in real terms. I say that's quite a weak commitment because I think that's almost never been breached since the NHS was brought in 1948. So really this is an act of writing something down that would have happened anyway. But in contrast to the modestness of those spending plans, both parties made really very ambitious commitments on very short timetables for what they want the NHS to actually deliver. They both want to implement the NHS workforce plan. Remember, Paul told you this was the biggest fiscal event of his lifetime. And that could require real terms funding growth of around 3.6% year on year. As if that weren't enough, the parties also want to achieve existing targets on elective waiting times, on ambulances, on cancer, on A&E. They want to build more hospitals. They want to increase mental health provision. They want to do something about dentistry. You start to add all of those things up, and some of these commitments are very ambitious indeed, have not been reached for a decade or more. You start to add all of this up, and you realize that even on its own, the NHS long-term workforce plan may still not be enough to reach all of those targets, certainly not on the timescales that the parties have set out. But let's be generous. Let's put it in at 3.6%, that number that it would cost to implement the NHS workforce plan. On its own, that means that the Labour plans see no real-term spending increase for any other areas of public services. The Conservative plans leave other public services on track for small year-on-year cuts. And we're not done yet. Because the next thing that happens is we have to look at our international commitments, where we have statutory responsibilities. Both parties, no difference at all on foreign aid. They want to keep spending at 0.5% of GDP, and they want to raise it to 0.7 when fiscal circumstances allow. You can translate that as when it moves sufficiently high up the priority list that we actually want to do something about it. They also both have an ambition to raise defence spending to 2.5% of national income, but the difference here is that the Conservatives have actually set out a timeline for that. They want to do that by 2030, and they've set out some plans for how they would fund that, largely by savings from civil service headcount and from reallocating some R&D spending. That's a really big deal because this reverses a very long-term trend of cutting defence spending and reallocating that money into other areas of the welfare state, largely the health service. So we could be on track, very, very unusually, to see both defence spending and health spending rising at the same time. Once we put those international commitments into play, the picture changes. So both parties, for example, on aid are going to need to increase spending year on year. That's to keep up with the growth rate of the economy and keep that constant in terms of national income. The Conservatives, because they want to move faster and further on defence, they're going to allocate more to defence spending. And that leaves other areas of public services on track for cuts that are starting to look a little bit more meaningful. We're still not done. So now we have to think about what's happening to schools. Both of the parties made quite a lot of really specific, relatively small commitments. You know, there's agreement about wanting to do more teachers, get more specialist teachers in. There's agreement about wanting to improve the provision of mental health in schools. Both of those are very welcome things. There are some other smaller bits around breakfast clubs or teacher training or specific curriculum reforms. But the big picture here is what we didn't hear about. In the Conservative manifesto, we heard that they want to protect school spending in real terms per pupil. The Labour manifesto made no commitment at all, although you might think that something similar is implied by this overarching commitment to no more austerity. But falling pupil numbers were on track to lose around 400,000 pupils between now and the end of the next Parliament. So with pupil numbers falling, protecting spending in per pupil terms translates into a cut to the overall schools budget. My colleague Luke Sibieta has written quite a bit about how difficult that might be to deliver. Keeping, for example, total school spending flat in real terms would cost an additional $3.5 billion in today's prices by the time you get to 2028. So this is a meaningful difference. And you can see that by what's happening here. The Labour line looks slightly different because they've announced a little bit more of these kind of small top-ups, but largely protecting school spending in per pupil terms means pretty meaningful cuts in overall school budgets. The final piece that both parties agree on are new childcare entitlements. So these are coming in, these have already started coming in. They were announced in the March 2023 budget, and they're going to expand childcare eligibility to children 2 and under in working households. This is relatively small in fiscal terms. It's about £4 billion a year, but it's really meaningful in the sense that this is the one area where parties are not only really genuinely trying to protect core spending, they're doing something very ambitious, and they're really trying to establish effectively a new branch of the welfare state. So put all of that together, and where do we get? For everything I haven't talked about, for those unprotected areas, Labour's plans under this set of assumptions would mean that you'd need to find about £5 billion a year by 2028 to top up those unprotected areas if you wanted to avoid seeing any cuts. The Conservative number would be about £14 billion. But remember, these are based on assumptions. So this is not a prediction for the future. This is an illustrative exercise. And you could change some of those assumptions. If, for example, you wanted to be more generous to schools and protect that budget in total terms rather than per pupil, you see that those cuts for unprotected areas all of a sudden look substantially bigger. The more generous you are on some protected services, the bigger the cuts you're going to have to find elsewhere. Overall, this is a budget constraint, and the parties have to make choices within that. What might some of those choices mean then? Let's think about some of those unprotected areas. The first one is local government. And both parties, credit to them, pledged multi-year funding settlements. That's great, that'll give local government a little bit more certainty. But they were really very silent on how much funding might actually be attached to those multi-year funding settlements. And that really matters because you end up with a very different picture for council finances depending on two decisions, what's happening to core grants and what's happening to council tax. Under the most optimistic scenario for councils are allowed to keep putting council tax up at 5% a year, and their grants are frozen in real terms. That could mean that they have around 2.5% year-on-year growth in their resources. But things could equally turn out quite differently. If grants were cut in line with how they were cut during the 2010s and councils had a ceiling on how quickly they could raise council tax of 3% a year, you could easily end up with them having less than 0.5% year-on-year growth. And even that most optimistic scenario, even that 2.5%, that's quite far away from what the Local Government Association estimates would be necessary to meet the fast rising pressures on councils' budgets, so things like high-need services, adult social care, children's social care. The LGA reckons that councils would need 4.5% if spending pressures continue to rise as quickly as they have done. And in all of this, I've not talked at all about adult social care. So both parties propose to expand social care for adults, and essentially by bringing more people into eligibility for subsidies. But the funding that was announced for this program in the 2021 spending review has since been reallocated to other priorities, so it's not in the baseline anymore. That means that if you wanted to pay for those social care reforms without taking money elsewhere from councils' budgets, you'd need to find about an extra £4 billion a year. Courts and prisons is another one that we sometimes don't hear very much about. Both parties really stress their tough on crime message. They want more police, they want more crime prevention, they want more criminal sanctions, they want tougher sanctions, they want lock them up, put them in jail, prevent the crime, but be tough on the criminals. But the backdrop for this is a rising court backlog and full prisons. When I talk about the rising court backlog, look at what's happened to the backlog in that green line on the left. It's massively increased, and particularly that purple line at the bottom. It used to be virtually unheard of that cases would wait more than 2 years to be heard. We now have almost 7,000 cases in that group. So this backlog has really exploded. And on the right, I'm showing you prison occupancy rates. So pretty much since these statistics started, prisons have been operating at more than their sort of notional capacity, more than what they really should be. They've then developed a second metric called operational capacity, which is, okay, if we make some prisoners share some rooms and do some more things to try and be a bit more efficient, where are we? On that metric, we're now virtually at 100% occupancy. So even with those efficiencies, prisons quite literally are almost full. What about skills and training? Well, one thing that the manifestos both agreed on was a real emphasis on young people, on skills, and on training. Great. But actually, we see very different approaches in the two manifestos. The Conservative Party has 4 really big reforms. They want to replace A-levels and T-levels with the Advanced British Standard. They want to do national service for all 18-year-olds. They want to get rid of low-value university courses taken by around 1 in 8 undergraduates. And they want to deliver an extra 100,000 apprenticeships. Any one of those would be a big reform on its own merits. Trying to do all 4 of them at once means that you really are radically reshaping the post-16 education system. And remember that this is a system that has already had something like 8 major overhauls just since 2010. So at a time when you're trying to build employers' trust in the system and these qualifications, what we're seeing is instead stop, start, change, do something different, move down a different direction. The Labour Party offer is quite different. So they're really focused on refining and rebranding existing policies. The big headline here is that they want to replace the apprenticeship levy with a growth and skills levy. That gives employers a bit more flexibility. And they want to bring together new bodies and put together sort of existing services into a youth guarantee. That's all potentially very sensible. There's a need for clearer strategy and a clearer direction in the skills system. But radical reform, this is not. What both manifestos were silent on, though, is what they want to do about core funding for colleges. Neither party made promises here, and protecting college funding in per-pupil real terms would cost you around $400 million by 2028. That would go nowhere towards reversing the 9% cut in per-pupil funding that we've seen since 2010. On to the final bit of the adult skills system then. What about higher education financing? Well, here, the Labour Party concluded that higher education is in crisis. That was a very clear, firm statement. The Conservative Party literally doesn't have the words higher education in its manifesto anywhere. They do talk about universities. They talk about scrapping some low-value courses and reforming the curriculum. They don't touch the financing of the system at all. And the issue here, as my colleagues have set out, is that we've seen resources for teaching domestic undergraduate students really squeezed over time. In 2012, the tuition fee cap was trebled, and since then it's largely been frozen in cash terms, barring one small increase in 2017. That's seen teaching resources decline in real terms, and actually at the moment they're at about the same level as they were in 2011, before that fee cap was raised. Now, on current plans, that freeze in the fee cap is penciled to end in 2025. If that happens, the purple line shows you what's going to happen. But neither party have actually said that that's what they're going to implement. And if they did choose to continue that freeze indefinitely, the blue line shows you that resources would continue to be eroded. So that's the issue. What do the parties have to say for a solution? I didn't make a mistake there. There were none. We heard nothing from either party about what they would want to do about university financing, and there are real choices there for them to make. So we really have, as in so many other areas, no idea of what the plan would be. So we're left guessing. We're left guessing on higher education. We're left guessing more widely on public services. The next government we know is going to inherit a difficult legacy. Spending has fallen by 4.5% in per-person real terms since 2010. And many unprotected departments have seen cuts of 20% or more. But the Labour and Conservative manifestos do very little to deviate from the spending plan set out in the March 2024 budgets. What they do is set out really big, meaningful, crunchy ambitions in a lot of different areas. Health, skills, universities, justice. The Labour Party manifesto alone has 17 reviews or strategies. Some of those surely are going to cost money to implement. We have little sense of what the resources will come from to actually meet this challenge, and so voters are left guessing. If they are going to keep to this spending envelope, what is it that the next government is going to choose to prioritize? And if they instead are going to look to top up those spending plans, where is the money for that going to come from?
Thank you, Christine. So in the final presentation, I'm going to talk about the public finances in the next Parliament and some of the challenges that whoever is Chancellor after the election will be facing. So an attempt to show the challenge in one slide here. The line here shows you revenues as a share of national income. Government revenues, remarkably flat through the 2010s, big increase since 2019, biggest increase over any parliament since at least the Second World War, and the OBR's forecasts show that revenues continue rising. What about spending side? Well, this shows you public spending as a share of national income over time. You can see the big increase in the financial crisis, a decade of austerity, which only got the size of the state on this measure back to where it was in 2007 after a decade of new Labour governments. Big increase again with the pandemic, and now the state operating at a much bigger level than what it was in either 2007-8 or 2019-20. But again, the plan's implying cuts to public spending as a share of national income going forwards. So you might say, well, hang on a minute, we've got a high level of public spending, surely that means we should be enjoying much better public services. How come that doesn't really feel to be the case? I think it's important then to look at why is spending so much higher than what it was in 2019-20. Spending has been increased by about 4.5% of national income over that period. As Paul said, the biggest per year increase under any Conservative government in recent history, and the fourth biggest increase per year of any government. Well, actually, 1.5% of GDP represents the increase in the debt interest bill, so that's not something that's going on things that we'd enjoy or like to have. 1.2% of national income is going on social security because of high household inflation, meaning bigger up rating, and also that big growth in the numbers receiving disability and health-related benefits that Tom spoke about. The NHS budget up 0.6% of national income, and the defence budget up 0.1% of national income. So one of those rare moments in history where both the NHS and defence are taking up a bigger share of GDP. So not much of the rest of the increase going elsewhere. The red line here shows you public spending that's going on, the sort of stuff we like to have. So it's public spending on things other than debt interest. You can see that that's forecast to be cut over the next few years. And in fact, you can see we get to a situation where the government will be taking more in tax and other revenues than what it's spending on things like social security benefits and public services. It'll be running a primary surplus, taking more out of the economy than what it's spending on goodies for the electorate. Not an attractive position to be in. The first time we will have run a primary surplus since the start of this century. So a relatively strong position at the end in terms of borrowing. Why is the government aiming for a primary surplus given we don't usually do that? Well, the answer comes when you look at government debt. And in particular, when you've got a weak growth outlook and you've got a lot of spending going on debt interest, that means you need to run a much stronger primary position. You need to have a low level of borrowing on that measure just to stabilise debt. And the forecast from the OBR imply debt rising over the next few years. And then, believe me or not, believe me, it's just about falling in that final year. That's how Jeremy Hunt is meeting his target to have debt falling in the fifth year. It's being met by a hair's breadth. So what are the fiscal targets set out in the two main parties' manifestos, and how do they compare? Well, one thing they have in common is they both focus on the forecast 5 years out. Now, there's some advantages of that. It means that if there's any temporary shocks to your economy, you can look through them and you can focus on the position once you've recovered from those. Both parties have set out a target that applies to a measure of borrowing. The Conservatives have said 5 years out we'll be aiming to borrow less than 3% of GDP. I think the thing to say about this fiscal target, it is very, very loose. Over the 60 years up to 2008, on average, the UK borrowed about 2% of GDP a year, and I think it'd be pretty rare for a government to be planning to borrow more than 3% 5 years out. Labour have said they want to have the current budget in balance, so not counting investment spending, they want to ensure that government revenues are enough to cover all of their day-to-day spending. I think on that I'd say it has much to commend it, but I'd also note it's much tighter than the Conservative Party target. The UK does not spend 3% of GDP on public investment, so on borrowing, Labour has a tighter target than the Conservatives. But in some ways that doesn't really matter because it's the debt targets that they've signed up to that will bind. They both have the same target, which says debt has to be falling as a share of GDP in the 5th year of the forecast. Now, I think there are good reasons to want to aim to have debt falling over the medium and longer term, but there's nothing special about having it fall between March 2028 and March 2029. It is an arbitrary and gameable target. For better or worse, it does not distinguish between investment spending and other spending, so it's not the case that Labour has more scope to increase investment spending because this is the binding target. It's the one that will tie their hands if they're going to take it seriously. So how big are the measures they're setting out in their manifestos? So on this chart, I'm going to compare the Conservative and Labour Party manifestos and compare them on their own terms. So I've not done an assessment of whether their numbers add up. What I'm doing is just saying, let's take the costings from their manifestos, let's look at what they're trying to achieve in terms of where they want to take money from and where they want to allocate it to. So start with the Conservative Party manifesto, those yellow blocks at the top, that's a reshuffling of some day-to-day spending. So taking some day-to-day public service spending and putting it in a different place, a reshuffling around. I think the bigger part of the story here is what Tom talked you through, essentially a cut to spending on working age benefits, plus a tax rise in terms of cracking down on avoidance and evasion, that's a takeaway, in order to pay for the tax cuts that the Conservatives want to implement, in particular the national insurance cut that they've signed up to. The Labour Party also have some tax rises, those avoidance and evasion measures, plus things like VAT on private schools, some modest day-to-day spending cuts. What they want to do essentially is use that money to pay for day-to-day public service spending. But notice their takeaway is bigger than the yellow bar there, the bigger than the day-to-day public service giveaway. So they're tightening the current budget. In terms of the day-to-day position, they're looking to raise more in tax than what they'll be spending on day-to-day public services. Then on top of that, they have their green investment plan, where they want to increase investment spending. That takes the total size of the giveaway to be bigger than the takeaway, at least by the last year of the Parliament, meaning that their plan would add to borrowing in the 5th year. So some pretty big bars there. I now want to compare this to some of the other parties' manifestos. To do that, I'm going to have to change the y-axis scale. We're going to have to zoom out a little bit. So now you can see that the Conservative and Labour offers are actually pretty small, not big changes from the status quo, and certainly not big relative to what other parties are proposing. I think I also want to stress again, we are taking their costings from the other parties' manifestos as given. In particular, with some of the bigger measures, I think they're much more questionable whether they would really cost as little or raise as much as the parties claim. So Lib Dems want to do a bigger tax rise, they want to do some welfare spending increases, they want a bigger increase in day-to-day spending, they also want a bigger boost to investment spending. The Green Party, similar pattern, but on a much, much bigger scale, big increase in tax that Paul spoke about, highly questionable whether they would really be able to bring in that kind of money, at least in a permanent sense. They want a more generous working age welfare system, they want more day-to-day public service spending, and a huge increase in investment spending. The Reform Party, also a very big package, but notice the colours are the other way round, essentially. They want to see really quite big tax cuts, actually tax cuts that we think will cost a lot more than they estimate. They also want to increase spending on the NHS and defence. How are they paying for that? Well, they've got these unspecified cuts to working age benefits, a claim that they can cut down on waste and efficiency to a huge degree across the public sector, and then this other bar, which comes from their claim that their package will boost economic growth, and a plan to try and reduce the debt interest bill by changing how the Bank of England pays, or changing the way in which the Bank of England remunerates reserves held by the commercial banking sector. Then the SNP, they want some UK-wide tax rises to pay for a more generous working age benefit system, and they want to avoid the kinds of cuts that Christine talked about. They also want to see additional investment spending. You'll also notice they have an other on the takeaway bar. Essentially there what they want is the UK to rejoin the European Union, and they say that will boost tax revenues. Now if the UK was to rejoin, I think it would boost tax revenues, but I don't really see how the UK is likely to join the European Union in the next Parliament if you read the Conservative or Labour Party manifestos. So that's a comparison between the parties. We can also compare these manifestos to what I stood up and told you about in December 2019. Now, I'm sure you all remember that, but just in case you don't, I've got a slide here. We only did a comparison of Conservative, Labour and Lib Dem manifestos. The 2024 bars here show you exactly the same numbers that were on the previous slide. You can see that the Conservatives now are promising a slightly bigger package of measures than what they proposed back in December 2019. Back then, they were proposing tax rises to pay for a boost to investment spending. Labour, you can see, are proposing a much smaller package of measures now. Keir Starmer's Labour Party proposing much smaller tax rises, much smaller increases in day-to-day spending than what Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party proposed in 2019. And the Liberal Democrats, well, on this metric, proposing pretty much exactly the same. So where would this leave the public finances? Well, tax revenue as a share of national income since the Second World War, shown here, and the March forecast. Under the Conservatives, we estimate that taxes would end up a little bit lower than that March budget forecast, but they'd still be rising. So the tax burden would be rising in the next Parliament, not as much, though, as it would do under Jeremy Hunt's March budget plan. Under Labour, taxes would also go up over the next Parliament and by a little bit more. And under the Liberal Democrats, they would go up slightly further. We can see how that compares to history. I think much has been made about how we compare to 1948. I think actually that's probably missing the point. We've never in the UK sustained a level of tax revenue as a share of national income at this level. So all of the main parties are aiming to keep it at a level that we've not seen before. I think it's also important to note that the differences between these parties are really quite small compared to some of the uncertainties we face. Again, if you look back at what we said in December 2019, we predicted that the Conservative manifesto would have put tax revenues on that dot there. As it's turned out, taxes are much, much higher. They've implemented a bigger increase in the size of the state as measured by tax as a share of national income than what we imagined back in 2019. What about investment spending? Well, here's the March budget plan. You can see that we have been investing a lot more than what the UK has typically done in recent years, but the March plan was for investment spending to be frozen in real terms and therefore cut as a share of national income. And it looks to us under the Conservative manifesto, you get exactly the same path. Labour wants to boost investment spending, so they would top the plans up, but it would still be falling as a share of GDP. So a Labour government would be cutting investment spending as a share of national income. Their top up to spending not enough to make up for the cuts that Jeremy Hunt has penciled in. Liberal Democrats, big top up to investment plans, would pretty much see investment spending remaining where it currently is as a share of national income. So where would that leave borrowing and debt? Well, on borrowing, I'm not going to show a chart of that. Essentially, borrowing would still fall over the next Parliament under all three parties' manifestos. The Lib Dems would be borrowing a bit more, but still less than what we're currently borrowing. So borrowing falling over the next few years to pretty low levels. What about debt? Well, this is the line I showed you earlier with the March budget forecast. Essentially, there is no difference as far as we can tell from where you'd expect to see us go under either the Conservative or the Labour Party manifestos. Under the Liberal Democrats, debt would rise and still be rising at the end of the Parliament because of the bigger boost to investment spending that they want to do. Now, this is all predicated on the OBR's forecasts, and the outlook for growth is very, very uncertain. Things may turn out different to what we expect. And I think that's something we've seen the manifestos really not engage with. So this green line shows you the size of the UK economy as forecast by the OBR back in March. That is pretty slow, steady economic growth. Certainly, whoever is Chancellor after the election, Jeremy Hunt, Rachel Reeves, or whoever, must be hoping that what happens is at least closer to what the OBR expects than what the Bank of England expects. They have a much more pessimistic view of what's going to happen to the economy. And they're not the only forecasters around. We can look at the whole set of independent forecasters at the Treasury surveys each month. You can see that some are as optimistic over the next 2 years as the OBR, but not many. Most are more pessimistic than the OBR. Most seem to have a view closer to that of the Bank of England. Now, of course, the growth outlook is very uncertain. Things could turn out a lot better or a lot worse. The OBR says that its forecast is meant to be a central forecast, implying there's a 50% chance that things will be better and a 50% chance that things will be worse. So perhaps one scenario is, well, let's imagine if we snap out of what's happened since the financial crisis. Let's suppose we grow at what the OBR thinks plus half a percentage point a year. That would be a fantastic outcome. It's pretty unlikely, but it's not totally implausible. It would bring growth rates up to the kind of level we enjoyed on average over the 60 years up to 2008. If we got that kind of boost to growth immediately, that would help the public finances, it would bring in more tax revenue, and it would allow you to avoid around £30 billion of cuts. So if you took the March budget forecast, you'd need an upgrade in growth of about that much to be able to expect to say, well, actually, we don't need to do the investment spending cuts, we don't need to do the cuts to day-to-day public service spending. So we must all hope for that kind of outcome, but of course you could imagine a world where growth turns out to be weaker than what is currently expected by the OBR. You could imagine it being half a percentage point a year weaker. That would bring it roughly in line with what the Bank of England expects, and the back of the envelope calculation I've done has a symmetry here. It would weaken the public finances by about £30 billion a year. So I'd certainly be recommending whoever is Chancellor to hope for a scenario more like what we see at the top, but you might want to be thinking about what might happen if something like the scenario at the bottom were to materialise. And there certainly has to be a possibility that come the autumn, the OBR suddenly decides it's not comfortable being as optimistic relative to the Bank of England and to many other independent forecasters, and there has to be a chance that it downgrades its forecast. At least I would say that it's more likely, surely, to downgrade than it is to upgrade when it comes to produce the numbers for the next budget. So, could growth come to the rescue because we do better policy making? I'm sure if you spoke to Rachel Reeves, that's what she would say. And I think here would be very sympathetic in the sense that if you implement better policies and you implement a period of stability around your policies, that certainly could, in fact, probably should boost growth. There's a range of areas, public and private investment, trade, competition, tax reform, planning, immigration, education, where if you have a relentless, consistent focus on growth, you implement a whole set of policies, you do that in a very well executed way, and then you're very patient, you will be able to reap the rewards with more growth eventually. A couple of caveats. Firstly, a lot of the investment spending, or all of the additional investment spending Labour's planning to do is green investments. That does not have financial returns as its primary aim. Now, maybe some of that green investment will be growth enhancing. Maybe some of it will try to eliminate some of the downside risks to growth, for example, making us less reliant on Western European gas prices. But at least in some cases, you could imagine green investments leading us to just do the same things we're already doing, but just in a cleaner way, so there'll be no financial return at all. And the other thing I'd stress is it really does take patience if you're trying to boost growth in a sustainable way. It takes time for any supply-side benefits to the economy to emerge. And to give you an example, where Rishi Sunak's first budget, March 2020, right on the eve of the pandemic, he added 30% to planned investment plans, fulfilling the Conservative Party manifesto commitment, I believe. The OBR looked at that and said, well, if you carry out all that extra investment, it will add to the country's capital stock, and they believed it would add 0.1% a year to growth. So that's a sizable return. But they also said that because it takes time for investments to actually happen and for the rewards to be felt, they made no revision to growth in their five-year forecast. They felt that the boost would be entirely felt beyond year 5. So it made no difference to the fiscal sums that Rishi Sunak was looking at the time for the period up until 2025-26. So to conclude, the major parties are really not saying how they would address the big public finance challenges either of the next 5 years or the big challenges that we face beyond that. The difference between the Conservative and the Labour Party offers are small relative to both the changes we have seen since 2019 and the uncertainty around the outlook ahead. Good policy making certainly can boost growth, but it can't do it quickly. And of course, we could get lucky. Things could turn out a lot better than we expect, and that could make a lot of difference. But I think we also have to ask the question, what would we do if we get unlucky? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Carl. Thank you, everyone. We've now got some time for questions. I've got some questions on Slido, but let's start with people in the room, if you haven't been sort of battered into submission by all of those wonderful charts. If you could identify yourself, we'll start down here.
Chris Smythe from the Times. I think you talked a lot about this trilemma. Now, when I asked Keir Starmer at Labour's manifesto launch, what would he do if his growth plans don't magically create huge amounts of money immediately, and would it be raising taxes, cutting spending, or more borrowing? He said it was defeatist to even ask that question, and basically said he'd show gloomsters and doomsters like you lot that we can do better. So what's your response to that? Do you think it's defeatist to think about this, or is it just prudent? And does it worry you when you hear political leaders making that kind of argument? Are there any perhaps recent examples of people refusing to consider downside risks and it perhaps not going remarkably well?
I'm not sure what you could possibly be referring to. I think it is realistic, as Carl was saying, that you can implement a set of policies that will improve growth relative to a world in which you don't do those. We know that we've got a completely screwed up planning system, and you can do better with that. We know that we've got a screwed up tax system, and you can do better with that, though it doesn't look like we're intending to. We know that we can, we could improve our relationships with the European Union, though that seems to be broadly out of the question. Look, yes, you can do better, but of course it's prudent to plan for something that's less good. All sorts of things can happen to the world economy. All sorts of things can happen to the OBR forecast. Any changes that are in the OBR forecast in autumn relative to March are probably going to have more to do with luck, with what's happening in the broader economy, than they are to do with what's in the Labour manifesto. So of course you should plan for the possibility that either the growth forecasts are no better, or indeed are less good than they appear at the moment. Now, that's not us hoping for that. I genuinely hope that we're completely wrong, that the growth forecasts will be much better and that a lot of these difficulties will be easier to deal with. But that's not a central projection, and I think it is completely, in a sense, inappropriate for parties not to plan for a world in which growth looks like what the OBR has most recently forecast, and indeed might look like what the Bank of England is forecasting, which is, as Carl showed, is much less positive. And I think that's part of our plea, is what would you do in a world in which you aren't getting that additional growth? But to sort of push the point home, even if you do get that extra 0.5% a year of growth, that's just about enough to avoid the cuts. It's not enough to pour loads of money into the NHS to get waiting lists down to below 18 weeks. It's not enough to make a completely transformational difference to child poverty, and so on, in a way which I think we can presume the parties want to do. So yes, a prudent, and I hope that this is going on behind the scenes, but a prudent party is hoping for the best, but planning for something that isn't the best. Yeah.
Thank you. Andy Bell, 5 News. Just to follow on from that, so 0.5% of growth a year, if we're lucky, is just enough to kind of keep us ticking over? Is that what you're saying? To avoid the kind of horrible choices that you've set out here, can you give us a figure for how much would be needed in growth a year of the sort of thing that Labour are presumably hoping to produce? Is it more than 0.5% a year?
Carl, do you want to take that one?
Well, back in the March budget, we said that the cuts to day-to-day public service spending implied by that were somewhere around the magnitude of 10 to 20 billion, plus there's 18 billion coming out of investment spending, total somewhere around 30. So I think the 0.5% a year growth would be enough to avoid all of that. Of course, on Labour, on top of that, you've got these really quite modest tax rises that are paying for a bit more spending too. I think the point Paul was making is you've also got these aspirations, presumably, to do a lot more, and it's questionable whether how much, it might be enough to keep you where you are, but is it enough to improve things to the extent to which you are diagnosing problems in your manifesto? I think that's the challenge.
Although I think it's worth saying that if you didn't undo the investment spending cuts, then that does give you more for the day-to-day spending. Yeah. But that, let's kind of say again and again, this relentless focus on growth, it still has big investment spending cuts built in. Let's just keep going along the front row.
Hi, thank you. Emilio from Politico. One of the big themes of this election seems to be the lack of trust in politics and the promises that get made. does that seem to be getting worse in terms of the promises versus previous manifestos? I mean, from the look of it, the state of the public finances and what is possible right now is in a particularly bad way versus the extent of the promises. And do you have thoughts about how much worse this can make that trust in politics element? Are the parties essentially failing to take the signals from the public about how frustrated they are and at risk of making that sentiment much worse?
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I'm not sure that what we've got this time round is any worse than what we've had in the past. I mean, I think actually if you look back to 2010, there were some much more realistic statements of the problems. And indeed, I mean, remarkably, you remember the 2015 Conservative manifesto, which basically said we spent 5 years kicking you, we're going to kick you even harder, and that kind of actually got them quite a lot of votes in terms of cutting welfare spending and so on. But you look back to 2019, and I don't think we obviously the Labour manifesto today is very different from the Labour manifesto in 2019, but I don't think we got a, broadly speaking, a kind of a better sense of where things would be. And of course, you can understand the nervousness given what happened with the Theresa May manifesto in 2017, which did actually try to deal with one or two of the issues on social care and so on, and that appeared to be disastrous. But one of the reasons for showing Reform and the Greens on this was actually, I think, to illustrate that you can appear radical, but without, I think, enhancing trust, because you can appear radical, particularly if you're a long way from power, in ways that aren't particularly realistic. And I think I think one of the issues here, in a sense, is when we're looking at funding additional spending, as colleagues showed, and it's remarkable if you look over the last 15 years. One of the things that Tom showed is Middle England has done really well out of tax and benefit reforms. You know, people in the sort of upper middle bit of the income distribution, remarkably, given that taxes are high and that we've had austerity and benefit cuts, are actually considerably better off than they were as a result of tax and welfare changes. And that seems to be, it doesn't look like the Conservatives are being rewarded for that, but that does seem to be quite a constraint on policy. If you want big money, then in the end, you're going to have to kind of push that chart down. And of course, you know, nobody, for completely understandable political reasons, nobody wants to talk about that. So is that, you know, creating a damage for a damage in trust more than it has in the past? Quite possibly, I don't know.
Hi, Melissa Lawford from The Telegraph. If a Labour government were to decide that the solution to a trilemma were to be to raise taxes, is it fair to say the most obvious option for them would be increases in capital gains tax or inheritance tax, those capital taxes you laid out? And if they did, how much money could they raise? Could it actually feasibly solve the problem for them if they were to go down that route?
Helen.
Well, I'm not sure really. They haven't told us. So, right. So, I mean, maybe the most obvious in the sense that if you want something big and chunky, we have lower rates on capital gains, other forms of income. Lots of people know about that now and don't like it. So, in that sense, it might be an obvious place to look. But as I tried to highlight very quickly, they wouldn't be able to do anything easy there, I don't think. Just pushing up rates a little bit isn't going to get you very much money, and at some point will actually maybe lose you money. So I think they would have to, if they wanted serious money, I'm talking, you know, billions as opposed to just rounding errors, then you'd have to actually start looking at serious reform and fixing the tax base. And then it would be a question of, do they have the political appetite to do that? So they could, obviously. I mean, we know how to do it. We've been writing about it for decades. So it's not technically difficult, but it would be politically difficult. So they could do there. They could also do what other governments have done and try, I mean, like, this is not a recommendation, they absolutely shouldn't do this, but almost just fiddle around behind the sofa and say, let's put up stamp duties a little bit, let's find some other taxes that no one really noticed, like insurance premium tax, or other things that we can do that no one's going to notice and it'll get us a little bit here and there. The problem is that it's not necessarily the best way to do it in terms of the least damaging way to raise taxes. So yeah, I think if they want big money and they've ruled out the big taxes, then looking at capital incomes would be a place you'd look. But you could also look at environmental levies in the short run for revenues, or look elsewhere. So it's not the only option on the table.
And it's worth saying, I mean, if you look in history, where have really chunky amounts of money come from? Well, most recently, Obviously, freezing income tax and national insurance allowances and threshold, that's raised loads of money. I can't remember the number. Helen will know.
That's like 40, 50,
40
billion loss.
tens of billions. I mean, but 3 more years are already in there. Other governments, I mean, both Conservative and Labour, have raised national insurance contribution rates, both in 2001 and 2010. But that's come down again. I mean, simply undoing the cuts we've had over the last 2 budgets would be 20 billion of additional revenue, but they seem to have ruled that out. What are we going to do about petrol taxation? I mean, that's going, even if we manage to raise that in line with inflation for the first time in 15 years, that's still going down and down and down as we move to electric cars. We need a government that's going to deal with road pricing or some other way of getting some of that revenue back. The other big revenue raisers in recent decades under the Conservatives have been increases in VAT, but that's again been ruled out. But Helen's right. You know, do some things with inheritance tax, some things with capital gains tax, some things with other taxes. You can start to raise noticeable amounts, but not really big amounts. Joel, then Larry.
Joel Hills from ITV News. I've got 3 questions rolled, 3 for the price of 1, George. Labour, if the polls are right, the next government's going to be a Labour government. Labour will tell you that it is unreasonable to ask it to carry out a spending review now. What sorts of statements could Labour be making in the spirit of transparency and candour, do you think? They'll also tell you that they don't know how bad things are, really, until they get into the Treasury and get the scorecard and the numbers. Is that a reasonable argument? And finally, does the IFS think that Labour has made promises in its manifesto that it's likely to end up breaking?
Wow. So on the first of those, I think they're quite right. I mean, nobody here is expecting any party to say that we will spend exactly this over these 5 years on these public services and so on. I think the things that would give us some sense of direction would be, firstly, just some sense of priority across all of the areas where there are demands on the public services. We've talked about higher education, we've talked about welfare, we've talked about child poverty, we've talked about council funding, we've talked about further education and health and so on. So some sense of priority. What's near the top of the list and what's further down the list, I think, would be helpful. I think a second thing which would be really helpful would be an answer to this question. Well, suppose you don't just treat us as a bunch of miserable defeatists, and actually you kind of address suppose growth is no better or even a little bit worse. Is our go-to to cut spending, or is our go-to to find some way of raising taxes, even if we can't tell you exactly how we're going to? Or actually, are we going to have a different fiscal rule under those circumstances and say, look, we're happy for debt to rise a bit? I mean, that just gives you some sense. It doesn't have to be precise. I mean, nobody wants, what will be a fully costed, program for everything, but a sense of direction. What are the values that are driving it? Which I think answers to those sorts of questions would give you. On your second question, I thought I saw Rachel Reeves ruling out, actually, that she would, come in and say, open the books and it all looks terrible. I mean, we would be very rude if someone were to do that. I mean, the books are wide open. You don't even have to look at what we've said. I mean, you just have to look at what the OBR says. The books really are fully open. And what was your third question?
About whether ultimately Labour's made promises it can't keep.
Well, I think some of them are going to be hard to keep. So I think there's a promise in there, or I don't know if it's in the manifesto or said previously, that they'll get rid of all waits more than 18 weeks for the NHS. I'm looking at, yes, so they have said that. That's going to be a really tough promise to keep. I mean, that will be really something to achieve.
The tax locks?
As we've made clear, we wish they hadn't made those tax locks. I think parties do find those sorts of things difficult to break in government, and indeed when the Conservatives tried to do that with national insurance, that's the one bit of the trust budget that Jeremy Hunt kept in place was to get rid of the very short-term increase in national insurance. In a way, if they really need the money, I kind of hope in one sense, that is a promise that they break. I think it's one of the less likely ones to break, in all truth. Larry.
Yeah, Larry Elliott of The Guardian. You've laid out the choices that the next government will be faced with. Raise taxes, cut spending, or amend the fiscal rules. What does experience tell you will there be the choice of the next government? Which of those three choices do you expect to see the future government take?
I think it's, I wish I could confidently answer that question, but I think the sense of particularly a Labour government coming in, facing the situation that we've got at the moment, if growth doesn't push up, then the pressure to either move the fiscal rule or to find more money from tax, I think will be really quite significant. I mean, we haven't talked about some of the other pressures here. I mean, the pressures on public sector pay, for example. I mean, one of something that my colleagues, I think Luke Sibieta, put out a couple of weeks ago, showing that, for example, teachers' pay hasn't risen in 25 years, whereas average pay has risen by something like 18%. We know that the doctors are continuing to push for higher pay. We know that pay in the civil service, any civil servants watching will be pleased I say this, pay in the civil service has been held down unbelievably over a long period of time. So there are so many pressures on spending. I think it will be very hard for that to be the thing that gives. So let me put it in that. Let me put it that way. I think it's very hard to see spending as the thing that gives here, given the scale of pressures that there are.
You asked explicitly what we've seen previously. I mean, we know that after elections we often see quite big tax rises, and often they're things that are not in the winning party's manifesto. We also know that when the public finances prove to be more problematic than we expect, we often jettison or water down fiscal rules rather than choosing to keep with them. We also know that over the period since 2010 at least, often when Conservative chancellors have got to a spending review, they've often topped those spending reviews up before allocating the cake. But we don't know if there's a Labour government that's what Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves will do. That's just, but those things have been seen in the past.
Yeah, so that history is really important. I mean, we didn't. One of the millions of charts we didn't show is the chart that shows how much has tax has risen in each budget for the last 40 years or something. You can spot the election years because they go up in the budget after elections in general, and particularly when there's a change in government. Again, that's not a prediction. The past may not necessarily be an indication of the future, but that is what the past tells us. Do we have other questions in the room? I need to be nice to Mubin. He's the funder.
Mubin Hack from the Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust. Could you just say a bit about public's debts and how that compares to other international countries and the scope there is to actually increase that, even if it's for a short space of time, to avoid some of the choices you've outlined in terms of taxes rising or services being cut? And then could you also say something about new taxes coming in potentially? So we saw under the last government the health and social care levy. Do you think we might see something like that to keep within these promises around taxes?
Really interesting questions. I mean, Carl will be able to give you, I'm sure, chapter and verse on where debt is. I mean, we've got, again, a lovely chart showing that if you look at the beginning of this century, our debt was really low by international standards, and it's now, if I recall, Carl, about average, or maybe a bit above average for G7 and way above average for OECD. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, big economies tend to have more debt, and the UK is a relatively big economy. Japan and the US are bigger economies and have a lot more debt. We clearly could choose to, I think, borrow a bit more for a period and have slightly higher debt. I think that if the reason for doing that is to enjoy slightly lower taxes or more day-to-day spending to avoid the need for day-to-day cuts, I think that's a questionable strategy. It's just delaying pain rather than really avoiding it. If you were making the case for some period of investment, again, I think you'd have to make the argument why investment in the next 5 years rather than, say, the 5 years after that is what I'd be questioning. Is it really the case there's a window where we really want to be doing the investment, and honestly we won't be doing it after that? I think that's where, what we can't do is keep having debt rising and rising and rising, and one good reason for getting debt down, as we know from the financial crisis, the pandemic, and indeed Russia-Ukraine, is that when bad shocks happen, governments step in and help households and businesses and public services, and it requires a lot of extra borrowing. So we want to make sure there's wiggle room there.
I mean, I absolutely agree with Carl there, but it was clearly a big political choice in a way for Rachel Reeves to focus on the same target. I mean, it would not have been ludicrous, let me put it this way, to say, look, this is not me speaking, this is me speaking in the voice of a Labour politician. Look, we've had 14 years of this shower, they've made a complete shambles of things, we need 5 years to sort this out, and that 5 years is going to mean that we can take an extra, let's say, 5 percentage points of GDP in debt at the end of this relative to what's being targeted, and then everything will, we'll sort things out and growth will get better and we'll start to take it down from there. Now, there's obviously a time consistency issue there. Obviously, everyone's going to say that at the beginning of their term in Parliament. Obviously, it takes the risk that Carl mentioned, but it also gives the opportunity to invest and spend more in the short run. Now, that would have been a choice, and we would have talked about it in these terms, and we'd have pointed out the risks and so on. But that's choice. That, as it were, is a road not taken. On the is there space for other taxes? I'll bring Helen in a moment, but let me just repeat an obvious thing that we have to do at some point is think about how we're going to tax motoring. As we move to electric cars, we're going to lose 30+ billion a year in taxation of petrol and diesel and the associated VAT on that. We've already lost, I think, 18 billion or some enormous amount over the last 14 years from failing to uprate that. So that's a big, difficult political issue there, but there's certainly scope for that. But Helen, do you want to say something about the possibility of things like the health and social care levy?
Yep. So you can obviously always introduce a new tax. We've seen lots of new taxes since 2010. We've got a report recently with a big long list.
Yeah, we've got a huge long list of new taxes. I mean, there's like 20 of them. It's extraordinary.
Paul's favourite list.
Nigel Lawson will be turning in his grave.
Yeah, and of course lots of those are small. They're like plastic bag taxes and stuff. But you obviously can introduce new taxes. And in some cases, I think motoring is the best example. We should be thinking about what we're going to do, because that's not a kind of a, wouldn't it be nice to tidy up the tax system? It's if something's going to happen, you have to deal with it. I think politicians should feel they have to have an answer to that question. But more broadly, I think what you can't get around is the fundamental question of what are you going to tax? So we could do something like a health and social care levy where you're taxing basically incomes. So we could decide to tax incomes more, or consumption more, or certain kinds of consumption, or profits more, and we could do it through current taxes or through new taxes. It doesn't get down to the underlying question you've got to ask is, who do you want to tax and how do you want to tax them? I think a lot of those answers, you wouldn't actually need a new tax. We've got plenty of taxes. We could probably achieve whatever aim somebody had with a current tax. So we might see new taxes for political reasons, but it won't get us around the question, in my view, of what do you want to tax? Who do you want to tax?
Yeah, any further? I've got a question here on the Slido from Ben Chu at the BBC. He says, Paul, you say if you had $5 billion a year to put into the most growth-friendly policy, it's unlikely that green investment would be what you'll choose. What sort of policies would you choose as the most growth-friendly for $5 billion? Well, it was... Helen, you were the one who kind of was particularly wanted me to say that. So what?
I'll take full responsibility for that. It's a wonderful point. So, in some ways, the point you're making is actually kind of, by definition, true. It's a simple one, which is just to say, if you ranked all the investments you could do for growth and all the investments you could do for the green thing, they wouldn't have the same thing at the top. I think that's not a radical statement. Again, not to say that you shouldn't do the green stuff, but as Carl said, some of what you might want to do for green purposes is just replacing what we currently do. So you can get to work, you can buy your clothes, you can do all that stuff. We need to do the same kind of stuff, just greener. So that's not going to make us more productive, just make us greener. I don't think there's one single answer to what do you want to do to boost growth. Obviously the government can do things like make direct investments. In infrastructure is obviously a good example. We do not have world-class infrastructure. Anybody who commutes into London is going to tell you that. We could make specific investments into certain science and technology investments. Governments do that all the time. We could be picking to, make industrial strategy kind of investments. We could also do some of the other stuff that would need some money, like some of the stuff that Christine talked about skills and education. So I think there's a whole bunch of things we do. There's not one place we should look. I think we have to have this, like someone said earlier, this laser focus across the board on these kinds of things. We could directly build some more houses. But it's just pointing out that I think, there is a choice here. If you've only got £5 billion, you have to choose. And maybe we should choose green things. That's not the thing that will get you fastest economic growth.
No, I wasn't really passing the buck there. It's completely...
now he says, no, he knows it's a good point. He wants it back.
Look, what would you spend £5 billion? If what you really focused on was growth, I mean, almost certainly you'd be putting money into transport, and levelling up in the north, we know is a catastrophe at the moment. It's not working. We need better transport links. We need better housing where people want jobs, and some of that's public money, and some of that will be private money. We know that R&D and so on is good for growth. All of those things actually aimed specifically at growth will probably have more immediate impact than focusing on the green transition. But we need to do both. I mean, none of us is saying don't do it, but we are saying these things are two different things, just like investing in dentistry. We might need to do it, but it's not necessarily the same thing as investing in growth. These are just different things. You've had a go, so I'm just checking whether there's anyone else who wants to go before I come back. We're probably running out of time, aren't we? And we already have. One last question.
I just wanted to follow up on that point, which is obviously you did the analysis on about 0.5% extra year of growth. Have you done any analysis of how Labour's policies to promote growth, which are mainly about investment spending, industrial strategy, skills and planning, how do they relate to that? Are they likely to get to that 0.5% or any other number?
I don't think it's possible really to answer that. I mean, I think just to repeat what I said, really sorting that out will help growth in the long run. Whether it's 0.2%, 0.5%, 0.7%, I don't know. But it's something we should do, and I don't think we should sort of hold back from it for those reasons. Other countries, we in the past, other countries at other times have grown faster than we're growing at the moment. Some of that's been to do with the position that they are sort of historically. Some of it's been to do with the policies that they've put in place. I just want to repeat, we do need to get these policies right. Some of them are hard. There are trade-offs. I mean, as I say, there are reasons that planning reform hasn't happened in an effective way. There are reasons, political reasons, why we haven't rejoined the customs union. It doesn't look like we're going to rejoin the customs union. There are reasons why we've decided to spend money on day-to-day spending rather than the kind of infrastructure that will really make a difference to growth. There are reasons that we haven't reformed the tax system in order to get growth. Now, I've said this before, there is a sort of dirty little secret in Whitehall and in the political classes. They know how to get growth. They just don't do it because they're scared of the electorate. Now, maybe one of the consequences of a supermajority is that they'll stop being scared of the electorate, though maybe not. There is one final question here. I'm going to warn Carl about this because it's from Anthony Rubin. It says, "Are you surprised nobody has stolen Reform UK's plan on reducing Bank of England interest payments on reserves as a way of getting some money?"
Okay. So for people who want chapter and verse on this, there's Sir Paul Tucker wrote a chapter in the 2022 Green Budget on the possibility of making a change here. Essentially what happens at the moment is the Bank of England holds a load of reserves from the commercial banking sector and it pays interest at the rate of bank rate, and it's got these reserves because it's chosen to go out and buy a load of government bonds through its programme of QE, and it's receiving interest essentially at those gilt rates, and those gilt rates are quite low relative to bank rate at the moment, so it's costing the Treasury money. It's not crazy to look at this. It's not crazy to consider not paying bank rate on some of your reserves. Other central banks do that in Japan and indeed in the EU. So it's not stupid to look at this. You have to go carefully. You have to think through exactly what it is you're taxing. Doing this would operate a bit like a tax in the banking sector, so it could have consequences for monetary policy, for the interest rates that people can get on their savings and will pay on their mortgages. And I certainly do not think you can, on any permanent sense, get the kind of money that Reform UK are claiming. So it will be much, much smaller in scale. And I think in that Green Budget chapter, what Paul Tucker was arguing is at the very least we should think this through for the next time we want to engage in QE. He points out that when we started QE back in 2008, it was thought to be much smaller and much short-lived than what it turned out to be. So he thinks ex post is a bit of a mistake and that we should think this through for next time rather than it being completely clear-cut that we should change the rules on what we've done so far.
Yeah, and I think the key point there is 35 or 40 billion a year permanently. Absolutely nothing remotely like that anywhere near available. A small amount in the short run might be available, but I think there are two reasons it hasn't been taken. One is that the amounts of money are much smaller than Reform UK suggests, and secondly, it is genuinely pretty complex. And thirdly, maybe quite appropriately, people are worried about exactly how this relates to the independence of the bank. Andy.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say on that point, your former colleague Chris Charles pointed out that, well, he assesses that you could save £23 billion per year if you were to tier interest reserves in a similar way to the ECB. And as you say, lots of central banks around the world, it's 23 billion, not reform sums, but 23 billion, doesn't that upset a lot of your calculations?
I don't think Chris thinks that.
It's not 23 billion a year once bank rate starts falling and once quantitative tightening reduces the size of the stock QE. I think the amount of money you would be saving reduces pretty quickly over time.
That was just the figure we gave for the net.
Well, you need to discuss that with him, but my understanding from conversations is his view is it's more like 5. Right, we should probably bring that to a close. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to my fantastic colleagues, both those sat here and many sat in the audience and back at the IFS who've just done such a wonderful job on this while I've been having a lovely holiday. And thank you all for coming. And hopefully you're now inspired to go out and vote on July the 4th. Thank you very much.